There is a place on this earth so old that most of human history has not even begun to scratch its surface. Not Egypt, not Mesopotamia, not the valleys of China where the first dynasties rose and fell before anyone thought to write them down. Australia, specifically the interior, the wide, red, silent interior that most people cross by plane without looking down. The place that looks empty from above, the place that feels, from a distance, like it has always been nothing more than dust and heat and the occasional shimmer of false water on a road that leads nowhere in particular. That emptiness is an illusion, a very old, very convincing illusion. What lies beneath that red surface, and carved into its rock faces and sealed inside its ancient stones, is something that does not have a good word in the English language. It is older than agriculture, older than writing, older than the wheel, older than every civilization that has ever collapsed and been forgotten. In some cases, it is older than life itself, as we would recognize it. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built approximately 4,500 years ago. The oldest of the Mesopotamian city-states, Uruk, emerged around 5,500 years ago. Stonehenge was under construction around 5,000 years ago. These are the things we point to when we want to talk about human antiquity. These are the reference points that have become shorthand for ancient. Australia makes all of them look recent, not slightly recent, embarrassingly recent, cosmically recent. And what is remarkable is not simply the age of the things buried out there. It is that so many of them are still being found, still being understood. Still being mapped and dated and slowly, carefully pulled into the light by people who have dedicated their careers to asking questions that may not be fully answered in their lifetimes. There are fossils out there that rewrote the history of life on Earth. There are stone tools that pushed back the arrival of humans in Australia by tens of thousands of years, and that are still being argued about in scientific journals. There are rock engravings so old that the sea level has risen and fallen twice since they were made. There are water systems older than civilization itself that are still, quietly, doing what they were designed to do. Tonight, we are going to go through 20 of them. 20 things buried beneath, carved into, or preserved within the Australian outback that are older than the pyramids. Some of them are older than the pyramids by thousands of years. Some of them are older by hundreds of millions of years. One of them is older by more than 3 billion years. We are going to go slowly. There is no rush here. We're going to let each one settle before we move on to the next. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand why the people who have spent their lives studying this landscape sometimes stop in the middle of their work, look around at the red rock and the empty sky, and feel something that is not quite wonder and not quite vertigo, but something in between. A sense that the ground beneath your feet has been here for so long and has seen so much, that the word ancient does not really cover it. The word we need has not been invented yet, but we will get close, get comfortable. Let the weight of the day begin to lift, and let Australia show you exactly how old the world really is. In the far northwest corner of Western Australia, in a region called the Pilbara, there are rocks that are approximately 3.5 billion years old. Let that number sit for a moment. 3.5 billion years. The Earth itself formed around 4.5 billion years ago. The oldest rocks on the planet date to around 4.4 billion years in Canada. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. And in the Pilbara, there are rocks that formed just 1 billion years after the planet itself cooled enough to have a solid surface. But the age of the rocks is not the most remarkable thing about them. Inside those rocks, preserved in a type of ancient chert that formed in shallow sunlit water, are microfossils, the physical remains of living organisms. Specifically, they appear to be the fossilized remnants of cyanobacteria, which are among the simplest forms of life on Earth, single-celled, ancient beyond comprehension, and according to the best analysis available, these microfossils represent the oldest confirmed evidence of life on our planet. They were described in a 1993 paper by paleobiologist J. William Schopf of UCLA, who had spent years examining thin sections of the Pilbara chert under a microscope. What he found looked unmistakably like cells. Cells arranged in filaments, some of them in various stages of division, preserved in stone for 3.5 billion years, as if they had simply gone to sleep and stayed that way. The scientific community has not been entirely unified on the interpretation. In 2002, in a separate analysis by Martin Brazier and colleagues at Oxford, suggested that some of the structures could have inorganic origins, that the shapes might be the result of chemistry rather than biology. The debate has continued in careful technical language in peer-reviewed journals ever since. But subsequent studies, including a 2018 reanalysis using more advanced techniques, have largely supported the biological interpretation for at least some of the structures, which means that the Pilbara, in the quiet northwest of Australia, contains something that no other place on Earth has been confirmed to contain: the physical remains of organisms that were alive when the planet was only 1 billion years old. But the story does not stop with the microfossils. Also in the Pilbara, in a coastal area near the town of Marble Bar, There are structures called stromatolites. These are layered, dome-shaped formations built up over time by communities of microorganisms, typically cyanobacteria, that trap and bind sediment as they grow. They look, at first glance, like rounded rocks, lumpy, layered, unremarkable from a distance. But the layers inside them tell a story of life building itself upward, generation by generation, over enormous spans of time. The fossilized stromatolites of the Pilbara date to 3.48 billion years ago. They are considered the oldest definitive biosignatures on Earth, structures that could only have been built by life. And there is something almost quietly astonishing about the fact that life, even then, was already organized enough to build things, not tools, not structures in any complex sense, but accumulations, architectures, patterns that repeated and grew. The living stromatolites of Shark Bay, further down the Western Australian coast, are often mentioned alongside their ancient counterparts, because Shark Bay contains one of the few places in the world where stromatolites are still actively growing today. They thrive in hypersaline water that most other organisms cannot tolerate, which is why they have persisted while everything else evolved past them. Looking at the Shark Bay stromatolites is, as more than one scientist has described it, like looking at a living window into the Archean Earth. The Pilbara fossils, though, are the deeper thing. They are preserved beneath the surface, inside rocks that have survived intact through billions of years of geological change, because the Pilbara Craton, the ancient rock platform underlying the region, has been geologically stable for an extraordinary length of time. It has not been subducted. It has not been melted and reformed. It has sat there, patient and enormous, holding everything inside it, for most of the history of the Earth. When geologists and astrobiologists want to understand what conditions might support life on other planets, they come to the Pilbara, not because Australia is convenient, but because this is where the record exists. This is where the evidence survived. 3.5 billion years beneath the surface of the Northwest Australian desert. And we have barely started. Move forward in time by nearly 1 billion years, and something strange begins to happen. Life, which has spent the previous 2 billion years as single-celled organisms in various configurations, begins to get complicated. The Ediacaran period, which lasted from approximately 635 million years ago to 541 million years ago, represents one of the most significant transitions in the history of life on Earth. It is the period when complex multicellular organisms first appeared in the fossil record. Not animals in the sense we would recognize today. Not creatures with heads and limbs and nervous systems, but bodies, organized arrangements of cells into forms that had structure and, in some cases, what looked like distinct anatomical regions. The best fossil record of this transition is not in Europe. It is not in North America. It is in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, in a site that was formally recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Area in 2023. The Ediacaran Hills, the area that gave the entire period its name, contain thousands of fossil specimens preserved in ancient seafloor sediment that is now, due to the geological upheavals of hundreds of millions of years, exposed at the surface of the South Australian rangeland. These sediments were deposited in a shallow tropical sea that no longer exists. The continent they bordered has long since moved and changed beyond recognition, but the organisms that lived in that sea left their impressions in the sediment, and the sediment hardened to rock, and the rock was eventually pushed upward, and now a person with a geological hammer and enough patience can find them lying in the open in the South Australian hills. They are called the Ediacaran biota, and they are deeply, wonderfully strange. Some of them look like ferns, flat frond-like structures that could have been anchored to the seafloor, arranged symmetrically, reaching upward toward the light-filtered water above them. The most iconic, Dickinsonia, looks like a segmented oval mat, sometimes small as a coin, sometimes as large as a bath towel, with a rib-like pattern radiating from a central axis. For decades, scientists argued about what Dickinsonia actually was. An animal, a fungus, something in an entirely separate kingdom that no longer exists. In 2018, a study analyzing organic molecules preserved in a Dickinsonia fossil from Russia confirmed the presence of cholesterol, a compound produced by animals. Dickinsonia, at least, appears to have been an animal of a kind that is now completely extinct, with no clear descendants in the modern world, but an animal nonetheless. Other Ediacaran organisms from the Flinders are harder to categorize. Tribrachidium had a 3-part radial symmetry, unlike anything alive today. Charniodiscus resembles a modern sea pen, but may not be related to any living organism. Sprigina, named after Reg Sprigg, the geologist who first described the Ediacaran fauna in 1946, has been variously interpreted as an early worm, an early arthropod, and something with no modern equivalent. Reg Sprigg was actually looking for mineral deposits in 1946, when he noticed the fossils on the surface of the Flinders Ranges. He recognized them as ancient, but the scientific establishment was slow to accept the significance of what he had found. The conventional view at the time held that complex life had essentially appeared suddenly at the beginning of the Cambrian period, 541 million years ago, which is a phenomenon known as the Cambrian explosion. What Sprigg had found challenged that view by demonstrating that complex, multicellular life had already been present for tens of millions of years before the Cambrian began. He was right, the establishment eventually caught up, and the Flinders Ranges are now considered one of the most important paleontological sites on Earth. What lies beneath the surface of those South Australian hills is not a curiosity. It is a chapter in the history of life that was written nowhere else as clearly as it was written here. The moment when life stopped being single cells floating in ancient water and started being something more, something that had form, something that, in some dimly recognizable way, you could begin to call a body. Now we move from deep geological time into something that is, by comparison, almost recent, almost, but not quite. In 1969, a physical anthropologist named Alan Thorne was excavating at Lake Mungo, a dry lake bed in the Willandra Lakes region of southwestern New South Wales, when he found human remains. Specifically, he found a cremation burial, the bones of a young woman, burned and then smashed, gathered and buried in a depression in the ancient lunette, which is the crescent-shaped dune that forms on the downwind side of a dry lake. The burial practice was sophisticated. It was intentional. It was, by every measure available to archaeologists, fully human behavior. The remains, known as Mungo Woman, or LM1, were dated to approximately 26,000 years ago. This was already remarkable. This was already older than the pyramids by more than 20,000 years. Then, in 1974, a station manager named Jim Bowler found another set of remains nearby. A man this time, buried on his back, his hands folded in his lap, his body dusted with red ochre. The red ochre was significant. Ochre does not occur naturally at Lake Mungo. Someone had carried it there, perhaps from a considerable distance, specifically to use in this burial ceremony. The care involved was unmistakable. This individual, known as Mungo Man, or LM3, was initially dated to around 30,000 years ago. Subsequent analyses pushed the date further back. By the early 2000s, some estimates placed the burial at 60,000 years or more, though these figures were contested. A comprehensive 2003 study published in the Journal of Human Evolution settled on a range of approximately 40,000 to 42,000 years before the present as the most reliable estimate, 40,000 years. This is the oldest known example of a formal burial with ochre anywhere in the world outside of Africa. This is older than any human burial found in Europe. It predates the famous cave paintings of Lascaux by roughly 15,000 years. It predates every human structure that has survived long enough to be called ancient by a margin so large it is difficult to hold in your mind comfortably. And the implications go beyond age. The red ochre burial indicates belief. It indicates a concept of death that is not merely biological. It indicates that the people who lived at Lake Mungo 40,000 years ago understood death as something that required ritual, that the person who had died was being honored in a way that had meaning to the living people who performed the ceremony, that there was, in some form, a world of thought and feeling and perhaps belief about what happened after death. This is not primitive, this is human, fully, completely recognizably human. The Willandra Lakes region contains more than Mungo Man and Mungo Woman. In 2003, a series of fossilized footprints were found on the surface of a clay pan near Lake Mungo after heavy rain eroded the surface layer. 457 individual footprints, made by at least 23 different people, ranging in size from children to adults. They capture a moment of ordinary life, people walking, some of them running, moving in multiple directions across a wet lakeshore. One set of prints appears to belong to a one-legged person moving at speed. Another set, with a stride length significantly longer than would be expected from the footprint size, suggests someone running faster than any human alive today could comfortably manage. These prints were dated to approximately 19,000 to 23,000 years ago. They are the largest collection of ancient human footprints in the world, and they are buried just beneath the surface of a dry lake bed in the interior of New South Wales, coming to light only when the right conditions remove the sediment that has covered them for 20 millennia. Lake Mungo itself is enormous. The dry lake bed is 10 kilometers wide and nearly 20 kilometers long. It has been dry for roughly 15,000 years. But for the 25,000 years before that, it was full of water, surrounded by trees, home to giant wombats and diprotodons, and regularly visited by people who had traveled across a landscape that no longer exists to fish and hunt and bury their dead with ceremony. Everything they left behind is still there, waiting in the sediment. For a long time, archaeologists believed that humans had arrived in Australia approximately 40,000 to 45,000 years ago. This was the figure that appeared in textbooks. It was well supported by multiple sites. It seemed settled. Then, in 2017, a team of researchers published a paper in the journal Nature that changed the number dramatically. The site was Majid Bebe, a rock shelter in the Northern Territory on Mirarr country, in the Kakadu region. It had been excavated before. A 1989 excavation had produced dates suggesting human occupation as early as 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, but those results had been questioned on methodological grounds. The 2017 excavation, led by Chris Clarkson of the University of Queensland, and used new optically stimulated luminescence dating techniques on around 28 quartz samples taken from different depths within the excavation. The results were striking. The lowest layers of the shelter, containing stone tools, ground ochre, and evidence of food processing, dated to approximately 65,000 years before the present. 65,000 years. This pushed back the confirmed arrival of humans in Australia by at least 18,000 years from the previously accepted figure, and it has significant implications not just for Australian prehistory, but for human evolutionary history globally. 65,000 years ago, the last glacial period was not yet at its coldest. Sea levels were lower than today, but not at their minimum. The journey to Australia would still have required open water crossings of at least 70 to 90 kilometres, because even at lower sea levels, Australia was never connected by land to Southeast Asia. This means that the first Australians were ocean crossers. They had watercraft, or at minimum rafts, capable of carrying groups of people across open water, out of sight of land. They navigated. They made decisions about when and where to cross. They survived the journey. And they arrived in a continent that contained megafauna unlike anything they had encountered before. Giant kangaroos, wombats the size of hippopotamuses, and a marsupial lion with crushing teeth. The tools found at Majid Bebe include edge-ground axes that are the oldest known examples in the world. The practice of grinding stone to produce a sharp edge, as opposed to knapping it, was long thought to have developed independently in different parts of the world at much later dates. But Majid Bebe shows it was happening in Australia 65,000 years ago. The tools also include grinding stones, which were used to process plant foods, and the chemical signatures of plant starch preserved in the sediment confirm that people were processing grass seeds, tubers, and other plant foods at an extremely early date. This is not survival behavior. This is cuisine. This is food culture. People were selecting specific plants, processing them in specific ways, using specific tools designed for the purpose, 65,000 years ago in the Northern Territory of Australia. The rock shelter itself is still there. The Mirarr people, the traditional owners of the land, were involved in the 2017 excavation and co-authored the resulting paper. The knowledge that their ancestors have lived on this country for 65,000 years is not, to them, a surprise. Their oral traditions have always included the understanding that their people have been here since the beginning. Science is still working out exactly what beginning means. The Northern Territory clay, the red rock shelter walls, the undisturbed sediment layers below the level of the 2017 excavation. All of it holds things that have not yet been found. The minimum age of 65,000 years is exactly that, a minimum. The actual arrival could have been earlier. We have not yet found the bottom. Here is something that tends to be underappreciated in discussions of Australian antiquity. Not just the use of ochre, the mining of it. Ochre, which is iron-rich clay or sediment in shades of yellow, orange, red, and purple, has been used by Aboriginal Australians since at least 49,000 years ago at sites like Warratyi. It was used for body painting, for rock art, for burial ceremonies, for the preservation of food, and for the treatment of wood and animal skins. It was a material of profound practical and spiritual importance across the continent. But ochre does not occur uniformly across Australia. The best deposits are localised, and to supply ochre across the vast trade networks that connected communities across the continent, it had to be extracted, which is to say mined, from specific sources and transported to where it was needed. At a site called Bukartu in the Flinders Ranges, there is an ochre quarry that has been in use for approximately 35,000 years. This is not a place where ochre was occasionally picked up from the surface. This is a place where rock was systematically broken and excavated to access the ochre beneath, where the debris of the extraction process accumulated in deposits meters deep over tens of thousands of years. It is the oldest confirmed mine in the world, not the oldest quarry where stone tools were obtained. A mine in the sense of a site where a specific material of high value was extracted from the subsurface, systematically, over an extended period, as part of a larger economic and cultural system. The ochre from Bukartu has been identified at sites hundreds of kilometers away. It has a specific geochemical fingerprint that allows researchers using X-ray fluorescence to identify it even when the ochre has been processed and used and redeposited at distant locations. Following the ochre's fingerprint across the landscape traces a trade network, a route along which Bukartu ochre travelled from the Flinders Ranges outward to communities who wanted it and were prepared to offer something in return. 35,000 years of mining, 35,000 years of a trade network, 35,000 years of people understanding that a specific material had sufficient value to be worth extracting from the earth, transporting across hundreds of kilometers, and exchanging for other things of equivalent value. The Flinders Ranges today, red rock, sparse vegetation, the sound of the wind. And beneath the surface, the broken rock of an industrial operation that predates every other mine in the world by 30,000 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza is approximately 4,500 years old. The earliest agricultural settlements in the Fertile Crescent, where wheat and barley were first domesticated, date to around 10,000 years ago. The development of formal irrigation systems in Mesopotamia is generally placed at around 6,000 years ago. In the wetlands of southwestern Victoria, in the territory of the Gunditjmara people, there is an aquaculture system that is 6,600 years old. This is not a figure in dispute. It is not an outlier estimate from a single laboratory. It is the confirmed age of the Budj Bim cultural landscape, which was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2019, as the first Australian site listed exclusively for its indigenous cultural values rather than for its natural features. The system works like this. The Gunditjmara people, who have lived in this part of Victoria for at least 30,000 years, observe that eels migrated through the rivers and wetlands of their country in predictable patterns. Rather than simply catching eels when they could, the Gunditjmara built infrastructure. They constructed channels of basalt stone quarried from the nearby volcanic fields that diverted water from the Darlow Creek into a series of ponds and holding areas. They built weirs that controlled the flow of water. They constructed traps, hinged gates of woven reeds set into the stone channels that caught eels moving from one water body to another without harming the population. The result was not a hunting ground, it was a farm, a managed engineered production system that provided a reliable, renewable food source without depleting the resource it depended on. The Gunditjmara smoked and dried eels for storage and for trade with neighbouring groups across hundreds of kilometres. Eel became not just food but currency, a commodity of sufficient value to sustain long-distance trade networks across the continent. 6,600 years ago, this was already running. To put this in perspective, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia were just beginning to develop written record-keeping around this time. The ancient Egyptians would not build the step pyramid for another 2,000 years. Stonehenge was under construction, but nowhere near finished. And in the wetlands of Victoria, a system of stone channels and eel traps was already operating as a functional, managed aquaculture enterprise. The knowledge embedded in this system is staggering. Understanding the migration patterns of eels requires generations of observation. Knowing how to engineer water channels so that current is controlled at specific junctions requires engineering knowledge. Understanding the sustainable yield of an eel population, how many can be removed without damaging the breeding stock, requires ecological understanding, generations of knowledge, generations of refinement. 6,600 years of a system that worked, that continued to work, that produced food and trade goods, and a way of life stable enough that the Gunditjmara did not need to be nomadic in the way many other groups were. The evidence suggests they built semi-permanent stone houses near the eel traps, settled structures in an era when most humans in most parts of the world were mobile hunters and gatherers. When European colonization destroyed this system in the 19th century by diverting waterways and draining wetlands for pasture, it ended something that had functioned for longer than any agricultural civilization in the Old World. Most of the stone infrastructure is still there beneath the wetland sediments. Archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar have mapped hundreds of meters of stone channels that have not been excavated. The full extent of the system, which may cover thousands of hectares, is not yet known. It is still being found. 6,600 years later, still being found. On the Burrup Peninsula in Western Australia, known to the Ngaluma, Yabarara, Madudunera, and Wangutu peoples as Murujuga, there are rocks covered in engravings, not a few engravings, not a site here and a site there. An estimated 1 million individual engravings covering tens of thousands of rocks across the peninsula and nearby islands, creating what is by any reasonable measure the largest and densest concentration of rock art in the world. The oldest of these petroglyphs are estimated to be between 40,000 and 50,000 years old. Some researchers argue for even greater antiquity. The dating is difficult because the engravings themselves cannot be directly dated. What can be dated is the geological context, the changes in sea level that have buried some of the rock surfaces and exposed others, and the weathering of the rock varnish over the engravings. What the engravings depict is a record of a world that no longer exists. Among the subjects, animals that have been extinct for thousands of years. A large bird that matches the description of the extinct giant bird Genyornis, which died out in Australia approximately 50,000 years ago. Thylacines, the Tasmanian tiger, which became extinct on the mainland of Australia around 2,000 years ago, but disappeared from the rock art of Murujuga presumably, when it disappeared from the surrounding landscape. a creature that looks, to some researchers, like the face of a diprotodon, the rhinoceros-sized wombat that went extinct roughly 46,000 years ago. If the engravings of these extinct animals were made while those animals were alive, then some of the Murujuga art is 40,000 to 50,000 years old. This would make it among the oldest art in the world, and certainly the oldest continuous tradition of art making on Earth. The word continuous matters here. People have not simply been making art at Murujuga for a very long time and then stopping. The tradition of engraving at Murujuga appears to have continued without interruption from the earliest engravings to the present day. The same sites, the same rocks, the same peninsula, across tens of thousands of years of human activity. There are images of fish, kangaroos, wallabies, emus, humans, and abstract patterns. There are images of sea creatures including dugongs and turtles. There are human figures in ceremonial postures. There are faces, stylized and otherwise, that stare out from the rock surface with a directness that is almost uncomfortable across however many thousands of years, separate you from the person who made them. The problem is that Murujuga is an industrial zone. The Burrup Peninsula hosts one of Australia's largest petrochemical and liquefied natural gas processing facilities. The nitrogen oxide emissions from industrial operations have been identified by researchers as potentially harmful to the chemical stability of the rock surfaces that preserve the petroglyphs. The preservation argument has been ongoing for decades, with traditional owners, archaeologists, and scientists on one side, and industrial operators and some elements of state government on the other. In 2023, Murujuga was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, which provides some international recognition of its significance. Whether that recognition translates into adequate protection remains an active and contested question. What is not contested is what is there. 1 million engravings, 50,000 years, a record of the landscape, the animals, the spiritual beliefs, and the daily life of the people of the Northwest Australian coast across a span of time so long that it makes the entirety of recorded history look like an afterthought. All of it carved into the red rock, waiting for the sun to move across the sky at the right angle so the shadows fall into the lines and the animals and faces emerge from the surface as if they are still alive. Beneath a significant portion of the Australian continent, specifically beneath Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, and the Northern Territory, covering an area of approximately 1.7 million square kilometres, there is water, not lakes, not underground rivers, a vast pressurized system of water-bearing sandstone and other permeable rock layers that form what geologists call a sedimentary basin. The Great Artesian Basin is the largest artesian basin in the world, the largest and deepest freshwater reservoir on the continent, and one of the most ancient water systems on Earth. The water within it is not modern water. It is not rainwater from last year, or the decade before, or even the century before. The water in the deepest, oldest parts of the Great Artesian Basin fell as rain during the Cretaceous period, during the age of dinosaurs. Some of the water currently being used by cattle stations in the interior of Queensland has been moving through the sandstone since Tyrannosaurus was alive. The basin formed during a period when much of what is now Central Australia was covered by a shallow inland sea. Sediments accumulated on the floor of that sea. Over millions of years, those sediments were compressed into rock. A rain that fell on elevated areas at the edges of the basin slowly percolated down into the porous layers and began to move by gravity and pressure horizontally through the rock. The movement is extremely slow, perhaps a meter per year in some parts of the system. Water that enters the basin at the eastern recharge zones, in the ranges of Queensland, takes between hundreds and thousands of years to travel to the southwestern edges of the system in South Australia. The pressure that builds in this system is what makes it artesian. When a well is drilled down into the aquifer, the pressure forces the water upward without any pumping required. The first European settlers who drilled into the basin in the 1870s were astonished to find water gushing from the ground in the middle of the driest continent on Earth. By 1900, more than 1,500 bores had been drilled, and the discovery of the basin effectively opened the Australian interior to pastoral settlement, because suddenly the question of water in the desert had an answer. But the exploitation that followed has been damaging. The natural pressure in the system, built over millions of years, has been significantly reduced by uncontrolled flow from thousands of artesian bores. Many of the natural springs that the water used to reach at the surface, called mound springs, have stopped flowing entirely. These mound springs were critical ecosystems. In a landscape of extreme aridity, they were permanent sources of water that supported unique communities of plants and animals, some of which are found nowhere else on Earth. The Aboriginal peoples of the interior have known about these springs for tens of thousands of years. The springs were waypoints on long-distance travel routes, places of ceremony, sources of food and water, in a landscape where both were scarce and precious. The Arabana people of the Lake Eyre Basin have maintained a relationship with the mound springs of their country for a very long time, a relationship built on knowledge of which springs flow in which seasons, what they support, and how they should be treated. The Great Artesian Basin is still there, covering 22% of the Australian continent, holding water that has been underground since before humans arrived on this continent, moving at a pace that makes glaciers seem hasty. And above it, largely unaware of its existence or its age, a red and dusty landscape that looks like nothing is happening at all. In the remote northwest of Queensland, accessible by unsealed road through cattle country that eventually gives out entirely if you go far enough, there is a place called Riversleigh. Riversleigh is a limestone plateau. It does not look from a distance like anything remarkable. But within the rock, preserved in what geologists call cave or lake limestone deposits, is one of the world's most significant fossil records, a continuous record of Australian vertebrate evolution stretching back approximately 25 million years. 25 million years of animals, a sequence so complete and so rich that UNESCO recognized Riversleigh as part of a dual World Heritage Site in 1994, grouped with Naracoorte caves in South Australia as the Australian fossil mammal sites. The Riversleigh record begins in the Oligocene epoch, when the Australian continent was still moving northward, still separating from Antarctica, still in the process of becoming the dry, isolated landmass it is today. The climate then was wetter. There were rainforests where there is now open savanna, and the animals that lived in those rainforests were, by modern standards, extraordinary. There were giant wombats, ancestors of the diprotodons that would eventually grow to the size of small cars. There were carnivorous kangaroos with short faces and powerful teeth designed for cutting and crushing rather than grazing. There were thylacinids, relatives of the Tasmanian tiger, in several sizes and species. There were platypus-like creatures that were significantly larger than the living platypus. There were birds, snakes, lizards, and freshwater crocodiles preserved in limestone with a fidelity that sometimes allows individual hairs and skin impressions to be identified. The most famous discovery from Riversleigh is possibly Thingodonta, which went unnamed for years because the research team literally could not agree on what it was. A tiny, apparently specialized mammal with teeth, unlike anything in the fossil record, and a body plan that did not obviously fit any known group. It was eventually identified as a member of a new family of marsupials, previously unknown to science, that lived in the Riversleigh rainforest 15 million years ago and left no living descendants. There were also the predators. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, is not found at Riversleigh, but its ancestors are. The evolution of the marsupial carnivore guild across 25 million years is documented at this site in a way that it simply cannot be studied anywhere else. You can watch the body plan shift over time, the teeth change, the skull shapes respond to different prey, across millions of years of ecological change as the climate dried and the rainforest retreated, and the animals adapted or died. Most of the Riversleigh fossil material is still inside the rock. The limestone matrix that surrounds the fossils is excavated using dilute acetic acid, which slowly dissolves the carbonate rock while leaving the bone intact. It is an extremely slow process. A fist-sized block of limestone might be processed in a laboratory for months before everything inside it has been recovered. The amount of rock at Riversleigh that has not yet been processed is vast. The paleontologists who work there operate on the understanding that they will not see the end of what is inside the limestone in their lifetimes, and neither will the people who come after them. 25 million years of Australian evolution, sitting in the rock of the northwest Queensland plains, waiting for a bottle of dilute acid and someone with enough patience to work through it, 1 centimetre at a time. The Simpson Desert, the largest parallel sand dune desert in the world, covers approximately 176,500 square kilometres of central Australia, across Queensland, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. It contains approximately 1,100 individual longitudinal dunes, running roughly parallel to one another in a north-northwest to south-southeast orientation, formed and maintained by the prevailing winds. The dunes are red, not ochre, not tan, not the pale yellow of many desert sand systems. Vivid, deep red. The color comes from a thin coating of iron oxide on the surface of each sand grain, deposited over time by weathering and chemical reactions. The coating builds up slowly. The deeper into the dune you go, the older the sand and the thicker the coating. The color of the dune, in a sense, is an expression of its age. The sediment in the Simpson Desert has been accumulating and being reworked by wind for approximately 10,000 to 15,000 years in its current form. The dunes are not static, they are alive in the way that geologists use that word. They are moving, growing, changing shape in response to the wind. The dominant winds push sand steadily in one direction, building up one face of each dune and allowing the other to slide away. The dunes migrate slowly across the landscape, a few meters per year in some cases, at a rate imperceptible on a human timescale, but significant across thousands of years. Beneath the current active dune surface, there is older material. Sediment deposited under different wind regimes, in different climatic conditions, in some cases during periods when the region was wetter and the dunes were stabilized by vegetation. These older sediment layers, when dated and analyzed, are an archive of how the climate and wind patterns of Central Australia have changed over the past 100,000 years or more. Aboriginal people crossed and used the Simpson Desert for tens of thousands of years. Are you following routes between water sources during periods when the climate was more favourable? The water sources are still there in some cases, and in some cases they are gone. Dry basins, fossil lakes, remnant channels of rivers that no longer carry water to the interior. The routes that connected these water sources and the knowledge of how to navigate between them are preserved in the songline traditions of the groups whose country crosses the desert. The language groups of the Simpson include the Wangkanguru, whose traditional country covers much of the desert's southern extent, and who maintained a presence in the Simpson until the early 20th century, when severe drought made the interior untenable without the outside support that the forced removal to missions had disrupted. The Wangkanguru knowledge of the Simpson Desert is the product of tens of thousands of years of people learning how to live in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, which dune troughs hold water after rain, which trees can be tapped for water in their roots, which plants signal the proximity of underground moisture, how to read the wind to predict weather days in advance. This knowledge, and the people who hold it, are still alive. The dunes are still moving, the wind is still blowing, and the red sand, grain by grain, is still building its archive of deep time. In the southeast corner of South Australia, in a region of rolling limestone country near the town of Naracoorte, there are caves. The caves formed in the limestone over hundreds of thousands of years, as slightly acidic groundwater dissolved pathways through the rock. They are not particularly dramatic by the standards of cave tourism. They do not have the cathedral spaces of some European limestone systems, or the ghostly formations of the famous karst landscapes of Asia. They are modest caves in a modest landscape in a part of Australia that most people pass through without stopping. But inside them, in a chamber called the Fossil Cave, there is an accumulation of bones that has been called one of the most significant paleontological deposits in the Southern Hemisphere. The bones accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years through a simple and terrible mechanism. The limestone above certain chambers had openings in its surface, sinkholes, crevices, gaps in the rock where animals could fall through if they came too close in the dark. The caves were pitfall traps. Animals that wandered across the karst landscape at night, perhaps attracted to the smell of water from below, perhaps simply unlucky, fell in and could not get out. Their bodies accumulated on the cave floor. Smaller animals sometimes entered through the same openings and died there as well. Owls roosted in the cave mouths and dropped the bones of their prey into the chambers below. Over 500,000 years, an enormous volume of material accumulated. The species found at Naracoorte include many that are now extinct and many that are not. Living species found as fossils include echidnas, wombats, possums, bettongs, and numerous small rodents, but the extinct species are the ones that have attracted the most attention. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived, a creature weighing approximately 2,800 kilograms and standing around 2 meters at the shoulder, is represented at Naracoorte by complete and partial skeletons. Standing next to a Diprotodon skeleton, which is possible at the Naracoorte World Heritage Caves Museum, is an experience that reorganizes your understanding of what the Australian landscape used to contain. This is not a slightly larger version of a modern wombat. This is an animal the size of a rhinoceros, with a wombat's general body plan, moving through forests that are now gone in a landscape that has since become farmland. Procoptodon goliath, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood approximately 2 meters tall and weighed perhaps 240 kilograms. Its face was shortened compared to modern kangaroos. Its foreclaws were highly developed and appear to have been used for pulling branches down to reach food, and it was capable of bipedal locomotion, but also, evidence suggests, of quadrupedal movement at high speed. It ate browsed vegetation from tall shrubs and low trees. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, is also represented at Naracoorte. It was approximately the size of a modern leopard, and its dentition was unlike that of any other known mammalian predator. Rather than developing canine teeth as the primary killing weapons, Thylacoleo evolved its incisors into enlarged blade-like structures, and its rear premolars into enormous shearing carnassials capable of cutting through bone. Its thumb claw was semi-retractable, like a cat's, and was proportionally one of the largest thumb claws of any known mammal. All of these animals coexisted with humans. The evidence from sites across Australia suggests that people were present on the continent before the megafauna extinction event, which occurred roughly 46,000 years ago for most species. The cause of the extinction is still actively debated: climate change, hunting pressure, or some combination of both. The debate has been going on for decades and is unlikely to be fully resolved. What is resolved is that the bones are there, hundreds of thousands of individual specimens, layered in the Naracoorte cave system, still being excavated, still being analysed, with sections of the chamber floor that have been sealed under preservation protocols and will not be touched until analytical techniques improve sufficiently to extract maximum information from the deposit. In the bones of the Naracoorte giants, the full history of the Australian Pleistocene is buried. The age before people, the age of the people's arrival, the age of the extinction, the aftermath, all of it in layers under the limestone of South Australia. Kata, known in English as Lake Eyre, is the largest lake in Australia, and when it is full, the largest lake in the world that is fed primarily by rainfall rather than a permanent river system. It is also, most of the time, completely dry. The lake sits at 15 metres below sea level, the lowest point in Australia. The basin that drains into it covers approximately 1.14 million square kilometres, around 1/6 of the entire Australian continent, when significant rainfall occurs in Queensland and the Northern Territory. Yet the water that falls hundreds of kilometres away begins to flow toward the lake along ancient river systems, the Georgina, the Diamantina, the Cooper Creek. The water moves slowly. It takes weeks, sometimes months, to travel the length of the river systems and reach the lake. When it arrives, the lake fills, and for a short period, perhaps a year or two before evaporation removes the water again, the Simpson and Sturtstony deserts are bordered by an inland sea that is visible from space. This happens on average once or twice a decade for partial filling, and once or twice a century for the major floods that fill the lake to significant depth. The last major flood was in 2010 to 2011. The lake has been filling and drying in this pattern for millions of years, but the basin itself is much older. The geological structure of the Lake Eyre Basin dates to the Cretaceous period, approximately 100 million years ago, when much of Central Australia was covered by a shallow inland sea called the Eyre Sea. This sea was connected to both the northern and southern oceans at different times, and at its maximum extent, it covered approximately 60% of the current Australian continent. The sedimentary rocks that underlie the Lake Eyre Basin were deposited on the floor of this ancient sea, and the basin that now drains toward the lowest point of the continent is in part a ghost of the ancient seafloor topography that was left behind when the Eyre Sea retreated. The fossil record of the Eyre Sea is preserved in the rocks of the basin. Marine reptiles, including plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, have been found in the Cretaceous sediments. The most famous is a plesiosaur nicknamed Dino, found near Boulia in Queensland in 1999, whose remains are now on display in the Kronosaurus Corner Museum. This animal swam in a sea that covered what is now one of the driest parts of Australia, in water warm enough to support tropical marine life, 100 million years ago. Beneath the dry surface of the Lake Eyre Basin, beneath the salt and the ancient lakebed sediments, and the Cretaceous marine deposits, the Great Artesian Basin holds its ancient water. Two vast geological systems stacked on top of each other, one the ghost of an ancient sea, the other the reservoir of an ancient rain, and at the bottom of both, the lowest point of the continent, a lake that is usually dry, that fills with the slowness of a continent breathing, and that has been doing this for longer than anything we build will last. The Arabana people, the traditional owners of Kata, know this lake in all its moods. They know it dry, a salt flat that stretches to every horizon, so flat that the curvature of the earth is visible. They know it full, an inland sea that returns the sky to the earth and confuses birds crossing the continent into landing where there was no water last season. They know the flood events that bring life, the pelicans that arrive seemingly from nowhere to nest on the filling lake, the fish that somehow survive in the ephemeral pools of the river systems and recolonize the lake when it fills. This knowledge is tens of thousands of years old. This one is different from the others. It is not a fossil. It is not a stone tool. It is not a geological feature or a physical structure that you can excavate and date in a laboratory. And yet, it may be the most remarkable thing on this list, because what it represents is not matter preserved in rock, but knowledge preserved in memory across an almost incomprehensible span of time. The Aboriginal Australian peoples navigated a continent of approximately 7.7 million square kilometres. They did so on foot, across environments ranging from tropical rainforest to temperate coast to alpine plateau to hyper-arid desert. They maintained trade networks across thousands of kilometres. They communicated across language groups. They found water in landscapes where rainfall was measured in millimetres per year. They did all of this without maps, without writing, without any of the technological infrastructure that modern people associate with the ability to navigate complex terrain over long distances. They did it with songs. The songlines, also called dreaming tracks or singing tracks, are a system of routes across the Australian continent that are encoded in ceremonial songs, dances, and narrative traditions. Each song describes a stretch of country, its landmarks, its water sources, its dangers, its spiritual significance, its relationship to the beings of the dreaming who are understood to have shaped the landscape in the time of creation. By learning and performing the songs in the correct sequence, a person learns the route. The songs function as what a cognitive scientist might call a spatial memory encoding system. The sequence of events in the song corresponds to the sequence of landmarks on the ground. Specific verses describe specific places. The rhythm and melody of the song embed the information in long-term memory through musical repetition in ways that make it extremely resistant to forgetting. The songline network is not a single system. It is an interconnected web of overlapping routes, belonging to different groups, maintained by different custodians, crossing each other's territories at specific intersection points where ceremonies could be performed and information exchanged. The roots of different groups connected at nodes, often significant water sources or ceremonial sites, where the responsibilities and custodianship passed from one group to the next. There is a growing body of academic research suggesting that some of the information encoded in the songlines is genuinely ancient, not ancient in the sense of centuries, ancient in the sense of geological time. In 2020, a paper published in the journal Australian Geographer analysed Aboriginal oral traditions from coastal communities around Australia and found that multiple traditions appeared to contain accurate geographical descriptions of coastlines as they existed before the end of the last glacial period, approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, when sea levels rose by more than 100 metres globally. The traditions describe specific bays, headlands, and islands that now exist only as submerged features on the continental shelf, features that have not been above water since before the Neolithic. If this analysis is correct, and elements of the songline tradition preserve accurate geographical information that is more than 7,000 years old, this would make the oral tradition the oldest known continuously maintained geographical knowledge system in the world. The oldest known in the world. The paths are still there, crossing the continent in invisible lines that correspond to routes mapped in the landscape of memory rather than paper. In the outback, in the desert, in the ranges, the songlines run through the same country they have run through for longer than any other human tradition anywhere on Earth. Most people who see Uluru for the first time are looking at the shape of it, the impossible smooth red dome rising from the flat plain, the way it catches the light at sunset and seems to glow from within as if there were fire just beneath the surface. These are the things photographs try to capture, and mostly fail to fully convey. What most people are not thinking about, standing in the flat desert looking at a rock that rises 348 meters above the surrounding plain, is that this rock is a seabed. More precisely, it is sediment. Very old sediment deposited in a shallow sea that existed in Central Australia approximately 550 million years ago. That sediment was compressed into rock under the weight of everything above it, transformed into a type of coarse sandstone called arkose. And then the geological forces operating on the region did something extraordinary. They tilted the rock, tilted it almost vertically, so that the layers, which were originally horizontal as they formed on the seabed, now run almost straight up and down through the rock. This is why Uluru looks the way it does. The vertical orientation of the rock layers is responsible for the characteristic rippled surface texture. The parallel grooves and ridges running up the sides of the rock are the edges of tilted sedimentary layers that were once a flat seabed. The actual formation that sits above ground is only a fraction of the total mass. Uluru extends approximately 5 kilometers into the earth below the surface. What you see rising above the plain is the tip of something vastly larger, a geological structure that goes down as far below ground as it goes up above it, locked in place by the surrounding rock that buried everything except its highest point. Tjuta, the group of domed rock formations 25 kilometers to the west of Uluru, has a different but equally ancient history. It is made of a different rock type, a conglomerate called Mount Currie conglomerate, containing large boulders embedded in a finer sandy matrix. These boulders were transported by water, ancient rivers, or alluvial fans, from mountains that have since eroded entirely away. The mountains that shed these boulders no longer exist. What remains are the deposits they left behind, compressed and lithified, and now standing 546 meters above the plain. Both formations are approximately 550 million years old at their time of formation. Both have been exposed at the surface for approximately 300 million years, after the overlying rock that once covered them was eroded away by hundreds of millions of years of wind and water and time. The current landscape, the flat plain surrounding them, was not shaped yesterday or a million years ago. It was shaped over geological time by the differential erosion of harder and softer rock, leaving only the most resistant material standing. The Anangu people, who are the traditional owners of the country around Uluru and Kata Tjuta, understand these formations through the framework of the dreaming. The Tjukopa, the Anangu law and knowledge system, includes detailed accounts of the beings who created the features of the landscape during the time of creation. Each fold, each cave, each water-holding depression has an explanation. Each has significance. Each is embedded in a network of knowledge and obligation that governs how the landscape is to be treated. The Anangu have lived alongside these rocks for at least 30,000 years, based on the archaeological evidence from rock shelters in the area. 30,000 years of people and 550 million years of rock. Looking at Uluru, you are looking at an ancient ocean floor that was tilted sideways and half buried, and then uncovered again over hundreds of millions of years. You are looking at something that was forming when the first complex animals were just beginning to appear in the shallow seas of the Ediacaran world. You are looking at geological time made visible in red stone in the middle of the desert. This one requires a detour, a short one, but it matters. Antarctica today is covered in ice. It has been covered in ice for approximately 34 million years. Before the ice, it was a continent, a green continent covered in forests with rivers and lakes and animal life. The fossil record of Antarctica, visible in outcrops along the edges of the continent where the ice has not completely buried everything, includes fossil wood, fossil leaves, fossil insects, and fossil animals from a time when the polar continent was as warm as modern-day Patagonia. Australia was attached to Antarctica. As recently as 45 million years ago, the two landmasses were still connected. They separated gradually as plate tectonics pulled them apart, Australia moving northward and Antarctica moving toward the pole. The separation of Australia from Antarctica is what allowed the Antarctic Circumpolar Current to establish itself, a vast ocean current that now flows unimpeded around the polar continent and is the primary driver of Antarctic glaciation. When Australia and Antarctica were still connected, the animals and plants of both landmasses were the same. The fossil record of the two continents in the Cretaceous and early Cenozoic show the same species, or closely related species, because they were part of the same landmass. When the connection broke and the two continents separated, the populations of those shared species were divided. The Antarctic populations eventually died as the continent cooled and froze. The Australian population survived and evolved into the unique fauna and flora we see today. This means that the ancestry of the Australian marsupials, the plants of the Australian bush, the specific character of the Australian biota, is tied to a continent that is now under ice at the bottom of the world. The platypus and the echidna, the kangaroos and the wombats and the possums, all of them carry in their biology the legacy of a time when Australia was part of a larger world. When the forest that covered the southern landmasses was continuous, when a possum's ancestor could have walked, if it was so inclined, from what is now Queensland to what is now the Transantarctic Mountains. All of that is buried now. In Antarctica under ice that is 3 kilometers thick in places. In Australia under the soil and vegetation of a continent that has been drying and warming for 45 million years. In the fossils preserved in both places. The Australian outback carries the legacy of Gondwana, the ancient southern supercontinent that broke apart over hundreds of millions of years and scattered its landmasses across the southern hemisphere. What Australia is today is in part the result of what Gondwana was 100 million years ago. The oldest rocks, the specific character of the biota, the deep structure of the continent, all of it is Gondwanan in origin. The ice of Antarctica and the red sand of the Australian desert are two faces of the same ancient story. The Nullarbor Plain is the world's largest single exposure of limestone bedrock, stretching approximately 1,100 kilometers across the southern edge of the continent, from South Australia into Western Australia. The surface is flat, almost impossibly flat, almost featurelessly flat, which is how the region got its name from the Latin nullus arbor, no trees. But beneath the flat surface, the limestone is riddled with caves. The Nullarbor cave systems are among the largest and least explored cave environments in the world. Some of the chambers are enormous. Cocklebiddy Cave contains an underground lake that stretches for more than 6 kilometers and has been explored only by cave divers working in complete darkness, in water so cold and so remote that the logistics of any expedition require months of planning. The Murujuga cave system has passages that extend for kilometers in multiple directions from the entrance point. There are caves in the Nullarbor whose full extent has not been mapped because no one has yet been able to reach far enough inside them to find the walls. The caves formed in the same way as the Naracoorte caves, slightly acidic groundwater, moving slowly through the limestone over millions of years, dissolved passageways and chambers. The Nullarbor limestone itself is approximately 35 to 40 million years old, or deposited when a shallow sea covered this part of the continent. The cave formation has been ongoing for millions of years since. Within the caves, two things have accumulated that are of particular interest. The first is bones. Like the Naracoorte caves, many Nullarbor caves are paleontological traps. Animals fell in and could not escape. Their bones accumulated in the chambers. The fossil record from Nullarbor caves includes megafauna species that went extinct roughly 46,000 years ago, as well as species that are still living. Some chambers contain bone deposits that have not been disturbed since the animals died in them. Complete skeletons in positions that suggest the animals died relatively quickly from the fall or from dehydration, lying on the cave floor in attitudes that are almost peaceful. The second is water. The Nullarbor contains fossil water, groundwater that accumulated during previous wetter periods of Australian climate history, and has been slowly moving through the rock ever since. Some of this water is ancient enough that its isotopic composition, analysed in the laboratory, indicates it entered the system during the last glacial maximum more than 20,000 years ago, when the global climate was fundamentally different and the Australian interior received more rainfall in different seasonal patterns than it does today. This water is not renewable on any human timescale. It represents a finite reserve that accumulated over thousands of years of climatic conditions that no longer exist. Cave divers exploring the deep systems of the Nullarbor encounter this water in the darkness. Perfectly still, perfectly clear, 20,000 years old. Cold and silent and waiting in the limestone far below a surface where the temperature in summer reaches 45 degrees, and nothing grows taller than knee height. The full extent of what the Nullarbor cave systems contain is not known. Expeditions using sonar, ground-penetrating radar, and cave diving are still mapping systems that have never been explored. The bones in the unexcavated chambers, the chemical signatures in the ancient water, the fossil record in the sealed passages are all still there, intact, undisturbed, waiting in the dark under the treeless plain. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels globally were around 120 meters lower than they are today. The water that is now the ocean was, at that time, largely locked up in ice sheets covering much of the northern hemisphere. For Australia, this meant something dramatic. The continental shelf, which extends for considerable distances around much of the coastline, was dry land. The area of the Australian continent was significantly larger than it is today. The northern coast of Australia was not where it is now. It was somewhere between 200 and 300 kilometres further north, where the continental shelf drops away into deep water. All of that coastline, all of that landscape is now underwater. The people who lived there are gone. Their campsites, their rock shelters, their hearths, their middens of shellfish and fishbone, everything they left behind on the surface is now beneath the Timor Sea, the Arafura Sea, and the Coral Sea at depths of between a few meters and 120 meters. This is not theoretical. In the last several decades, maritime archaeologists working in Australian waters have found evidence of submerged prehistoric sites. Stone tools have been recovered from the seafloor in shallow water off the coasts of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Ancient river channels are visible in sonar surveys of the continental shelf, rivers that once ran across dry land to a coastline that is now far offshore. In the north, what is now the Gulf of Carpentaria was, during the glacial maximum, an inland lake approximately the size of the modern Black Sea. The entire Gulf floor was above water, surrounded by higher land on the Australian side, and connected to the ancient landmass of Sahul, which included New Guinea as a peninsula. This lake, sometimes called Lake Carpentaria, had its own ecosystem, its own surrounding vegetation, and presumably its own human populations living on its shores. All of that is now beneath 50 to 70 meters of water. The first Australians did not arrive on a continent that looked anything like the Australia of today. They arrived on a significantly larger landmass with a different coastline, different internal geography, different river systems. They developed their cultures, their languages, their knowledge systems in a landscape that has since been substantially modified by rising sea levels and changing climate. The 65,000 years of continuous occupation at Majid Bebe includes 65,000 years of watching the coastline move and the country change. The Aboriginal traditions that appear to encode the memory of pre-glacial coastlines, which we touched on earlier in this telling, are perhaps the most remarkable evidence of the depth of this connection to a changing landscape. Traditions that describe islands that are now underwater, bays that are now shallow seas, headlands that are now submerged ridges, maintained across 7,000 to 10,000 years of rising water. The drowned coastlines of Australia contain an archaeological record that is almost entirely unknown. The technology and resources required to do archaeological excavation at 50 or 100 meters depth in open ocean conditions are significant. Very little of this seafloor has been examined. The amount of human history lying beneath the waters of the Australian continental shelf, preserved under marine sediment, is beyond current ability to quantify. It is there. It is old, and the sea has been covering it for longer than the pyramids have existed. Beneath the Western Australian landscape, most visibly in the region between Perth and Kalgoorlie, but extending across a vast area of the state's interior, there is something called the Yilgarn Craton. A craton is a stable, ancient section of the Earth's continental crust that has survived intact through the geological upheavals of billions of years. Cratons are not common. Most of the Earth's crust has been recycled, subducted, melted, reformed, and rearranged by plate tectonics over geological time. The places where ancient crust has survived at the surface without being destroyed are rare and geologically significant. The Yilgarn Craton contains rocks dating to approximately 3.7 billion years ago. These are among the oldest exposed rocks on the surface of the Earth. But the most extraordinary thing about the Yilgarn is what it has revealed from within its ancient geology. In 2001, a paper published in the journal Nature reported the discovery of zircon crystals from the Jack Hills area of the Murchison region of Western Australia, with uranium-lead isotope ratios indicating an age of 4.404 billion years. Since confirmed and extended by subsequent analyses, these zircon crystals are now accepted as the oldest known minerals on Earth. Not the oldest rocks, the oldest minerals. The distinction matters. A mineral can survive the destruction of the rock it was originally part of and be incorporated into younger rocks. These zircon crystals formed 4.404 billion years ago in a rock that no longer exists. The rock that contained them was eventually weathered and eroded, and the zircons, being extremely resistant to chemical and physical degradation, survived and were deposited in younger sediments that became part of what is now the Jack Hills geological sequence. 4.404 billion years old. The Earth itself is approximately 4.54 billion years old. These minerals formed just 136 million years after the planet itself formed. And there is something in the chemistry of the Jack Hills zircons that is, scientifically speaking, astounding. The oxygen isotope ratios in some of the oldest crystals suggest that at the time of their formation, the early Earth already had liquid water at its surface. Not a hot, molten, inhospitable ball of rock. A planet with water, with oceans, with a surface cool enough to have liquid water on it, just 136 million years after the planet's formation. This rewrote the scientific understanding of Earth's early history. The old model had the early Earth as a hellish, molten environment, hostile to any form of chemistry leading toward life, a period known as the Hadean, named for Hades, the underworld. The Jack Hills zircons suggest the Hadean was not as hellish as assumed, that liquid water existed, that conditions were, in at least some places, far earlier than previously thought, suitable for the chemistry that eventually led to life. This discovery came from a creek bed in the Murchison region of Western Australia, from zircon crystals smaller than a grain of sand that had been waiting in the rock for 4.4 billion years. The Yilgarn Craton stretches across roughly 700,000 square kilometres of Western Australia. Much of it has not been geologically sampled with modern techniques. The Jack Hills discovery was, in some ways, the result of researchers looking in the right place at the right time with the right technology. There is no particular reason to assume they have found the oldest thing the Yilgarn contains. In the Great Sandy Desert of Western Australia, just south of the edge of the Kimberley region, there is a hole in the ground that is almost perfectly circular. The Wolf Creek crater, known to the Jaru people as Kandamalal, is 875 metres in diameter. Its rim rises approximately 25 metres above the surrounding desert floor, and the crater floor sits roughly 55 metres below the rim. From the air, it is unmistakable. A ring of red rock with a white salt flat inside, geometrically precise in the way that geology almost never is, surrounded by the flat red desert stretching to every horizon. It was formed by a meteorite impact. The meteorite itself was a nickel-iron body estimated at approximately 50,000 tons, moving at roughly 15 kilometers per second when it struck. The impact would have released energy equivalent to several nuclear weapons simultaneously. Everything within a radius of several kilometers of the impact point would have been vaporized or thrown outward. The crater is what remained. The age of the impact is estimated at approximately 300,000 years. This is old by human standards. It is recent by the standards of everything else on this list. But it is remarkable because it is old enough that it predates the arrival of humans in Australia. And yet the Jaru people have detailed oral traditions about the crater that describe its creation by a spirit being in the time of the dreaming. How does an oral tradition about a 300,000-year-old impact survive? There are several possible explanations. The tradition may not be about the impact itself, but about the landscape feature, which would have been as striking to the first people who encountered it as it is to any modern visitor. Alternatively, the Jaru tradition may encode real knowledge about a geological feature that looked, from its moment of formation, exactly as dramatic and unusual as it does today, and the tradition may have accumulated around the feature over tens of thousands of years as successive generations sought to explain what they were seeing. The crater is also significant for what it contains. The interior has never been fully excavated. The salt flat that fills the floor of the crater sits above sediments that have accumulated in the sealed basin since the impact. These sediments are an undisturbed archive of the local environment going back 300,000 years. Pollen preserved in the sediment can be analysed to reconstruct vegetation history across 3 glacial cycles. Windblown dust preserves chemical signatures of climate events. The most recent layer contains the pollen of plants introduced by European colonists in the 19th century. The oldest accessible layer is older than the first modern humans outside of Africa, a perfectly preserved 300,000-year climate record, sealed inside a ring of red rock in the middle of the Great Sandy Desert. Goss's Bluff, 175 kilometers west of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, is another impact structure, older and more eroded. The original crater was approximately 22 kilometers in diameter. What remains visible at the surface is a central ring of hills about 5 kilometers across, the remnant of the central uplift structure that forms when a large impact compresses and then rebounds the rock beneath the crater. The impact occurred approximately 142 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period. Dinosaurs were alive when this meteorite hit. The Aranda people know Goss's Bluff as Tinarala, and their traditions about it describe a celestial being falling to Earth. Again, oral tradition encoding something real about a feature of the landscape that has been there for a very long time. The sky's been hitting Australia for a long time, and the land has been holding the memory of it. The Kimberley region of northwestern Western Australia is, among other things, home to one of the world's most diverse and ancient rock art traditions. We mentioned Murujuga earlier. The Kimberley is different, larger, more varied, spanning multiple stylistic traditions that appear to represent tens of thousands of years of artistic development in a single region. The oldest art tradition in the Kimberley is called the Gwion tradition, sometimes known by the name Bradshaw figures after Joseph Bradshaw, the pastoralist who first described them to European audiences in 1891. The figures are extraordinary. Slender, elongated human forms depicted in dynamic poses, running, dancing, performing ceremonies, wearing elaborate headdresses and decorations. The figures are rendered with a sophistication and a sense of movement that is remarkable for any period of art history. The age of the Gwion figures has been intensely debated. A 1997 study that attempted to date organic material in wasp nests built over some of the figures suggested a minimum age of approximately 17,000 years. Other researchers, working from different lines of evidence, argue for ages of 40,000 to 50,000 years or more for some examples. The debate has not been fully resolved because the direct dating of rock pigments remains technically challenging. What is clearer is that the Gwion tradition was eventually replaced by a different tradition, the Wandjina tradition, which is still actively practiced by the Ngarinyin, Warora, and Wunambul peoples today. Wandjina are powerful spirit beings who are depicted in rock art with distinctive large eyes and halos around their heads, with no mouths. They are associated with rain, monsoon, and the fertilizing power of water. The Wandjina images are not historical. They are living, active presences in the landscape, maintained and repainted by the traditional custodians as part of an ongoing spiritual practice. This is important. The Kimberley rock art is not a museum. It is not static. The Wandjina images are repainted when they fade according to cultural protocols that specify who has the right to do this and how. The tradition is alive. It has been alive for longer than European civilization has existed, and it is still alive now. The Kimberley also contains astronomical knowledge encoded in the art and in the oral traditions. Specific rock art sites are oriented to catch particular celestial events, solstice sunrises, the rising of specific stars. The astronomical knowledge of the Aboriginal peoples of the Kimberley has been described in academic literature as sophisticated enough to have served navigational and calendrical functions, allowing people to know what time of year it was, when the monsoon was coming, when specific food resources would be available, when ceremonies needed to be performed. Knowledge encoded in stone and in memory across 50,000 years. The Kimberley is vast. The rock art sites are numerous. New sites are still being found by researchers working with traditional owners, often in areas accessible only on foot or by helicopter. Some of the sites that have been formally recorded have not been revisited since the first recording. The full catalogue of what exists in the Kimberley is not known. This is the oldest continuous art tradition on Earth. It's still continuing, still adding to itself, still alive. The Adnyamathanna people of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia call their country Yata. It is a landscape of dramatic red gorges, quartzite ridges, vast salt lakes, and the remnants of some of the world's oldest mountain chains. The Flinders Ranges were once as tall as the Himalayas. Erosion has reduced them to their current modest heights over hundreds of millions of years. People have been living in this landscape continuously for at least 49,000 years. This date comes from an excavation at a site called Warratyi, a rock shelter in the Flinders Ranges, reported in a 2016 paper in the journal Nature. The shelter is not large. It is a shallow overhang of quartzite that provided some protection from the weather, but within the sediment beneath the shelter floor, the excavation team found evidence of human occupation across a sequence of layers spanning from the present to approximately 49,000 years before the present. The most significant findings from the deepest layers include the earliest known use of ochre in southern Australia, at around 49,000 years. The earliest known bone tools in Australia at approximately 40,000 years, and the coexistence of human artifacts with the bones of extinct megafauna species, including Diprotodon and the giant kangaroo Protemnodon, at depths corresponding to around 46,000 to 49,000 years ago. This coexistence evidence is significant for the debate about megafauna extinction. If humans and Diprotodon were present in the same rock shelter at the same time, then humans and the giant marsupials were coexisting at Warratyi during a period when the megafauna was still present in this part of Australia. The evidence from Warratyi has been used to argue against the hypothesis that humans rapidly hunted all the megafauna to extinction upon arrival. The picture appears to be more complicated, a period of coexistence, possibly thousands of years long, before the megafauna disappear from the record. But what strikes many people most about the Warratyi record is the Ice Age. The Flinders Ranges today are arid and warm for much of the year. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 to 26,000 years ago, the interior of Australia was significantly colder and drier. Dust storms swept across the landscape. The rainfall that currently supports sparse vegetation was substantially reduced. The conditions were, by most measures, hostile to human habitation. And yet, the occupation record at Warratyi does not show a gap during the glacial maximum. People were there. In the cold, in the dry, in the dust, they were there. Continuing to live in the Flinders Ranges through the worst conditions the Australian interior had experienced in tens of thousands of years. This persistence through climatic extremes is one of the most remarkable aspects of the archaeological record of Aboriginal Australia. Site after site across the continent shows continuous occupation through the glacial maximum, when conditions were at their harshest. People found ways. They moved within their territories to exploit the resources that remained available. They maintained their cultures, their knowledge systems, their ceremony, and their art through periods of environmental stress that would have broken any culture that did not have 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how the land worked. The Adnyamathanha people are still there, in the Flinders Ranges, living in the country their ancestors occupied 49,000 years ago, through ice ages and megafauna extinctions and rising seas, through everything. 49,000 years in one place. In 2011, a genetic study published in Science magazine analysed ancient DNA extracted from a lock of hair held in a South Australian museum. The hair had been collected in the early 20th century from an Aboriginal man from the Goldfields region of Western Australia. The genetic analysis produced results that were, at the time, genuinely surprising to the scientists involved. The genome of the individual whose hair was analysed did not fit neatly into the pattern seen in modern Asian or European populations. The data suggested that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians had diverged from the rest of the modern human population approximately 70,000 years ago, making them the descendants of one of the earliest groups of modern humans to leave Africa. This divergence time, combined with the archaeological evidence for occupation of Australia at 65,000 years ago, tells a story of a population that has been on this continent and nowhere else for an extraordinarily long time. Subsequent genetic studies have refined this picture. A 2016 paper in Nature, analysing ancient DNA from multiple Aboriginal Australian individuals, confirmed the deep antiquity of the separation and added important details. The data showed that the Aboriginal Australian population has been genetically isolated from other human populations for approximately 50,000 to 55,000 years. This means that while the populations that would eventually give rise to Europeans, Asians, and the Americas were continuously mixing, migrating, and absorbing new genetic lineages from one another across thousands of years, the Aboriginal Australian population remained in Australia, undisturbed by the genetic influx that shaped every other large human population on Earth. The result of this isolation is a population that carries genetic variants found nowhere else in the human species. Specific immune system genes, specific neurological genes, adaptations that evolved in the specific environmental conditions of the Australian continent over 50,000 years of natural selection. These genes are, in some cases, offering researchers insights into human biology that would not be obtainable any other way. The adaptations to extreme arid conditions, to the specific pathogens of the Australian environment, to the dietary patterns of a hunter-gatherer society in one of the world's most nutritionally challenging landscapes, are written into the genome. The genetic record also contains something that caused significant controversy in scientific discussions: traces of archaic human DNA. The genomes of Aboriginal Australians contain a small percentage of DNA from a population of archaic humans known as the Denisovans, a distinct species or subspecies of hominin known from fossils found in Siberia. The Denisovan DNA in Aboriginal Australian genomes indicates that at some point during the ancestral population's journey out of Africa and eventually to Australia, they interbred with Denisovans. Where this interbred occurred is not known. In Southeast Asia, presumably, somewhere along the route. But the genetic echo of that encounter, which happened at least 50,000 years ago, is still carried in the DNA of the Aboriginal Australian population today. Ancient DNA preserved in ancient hair, collected by a colonial museum in the early 20th century, unlocking a story of human migration and evolution that stretches back to the Pleistocene. The Outback holds these stories in living tissue as well as in stone. This one is, deliberately, the most recent on the list, not because it is less ancient, but because it is a reminder that the ancient is not always in the past. The Great Victoria Desert is the largest desert in Australia, stretching approximately 700 kilometres from north to south and 800 kilometres from east to west across South Australia and Western Australia. It is not the most famous Australian desert. That would be the Outback in general, or perhaps the Simpson. But it is among the most remote and least penetrated by roads, infrastructure, or regular human activity. In the 1970s, during surveys related to rocket testing at the Woomera Range, researchers encountered Aboriginal communities that had had no sustained contact with European or wider Australian society. People who had been living in the desert according to traditional patterns for their entire lives, or maintaining knowledge systems and cultural practices that had not been substantially modified by contact with the outside world. These encounters, documented carefully and respectfully by anthropologists, including Philip Clark and Norman Tyndale, revealed something remarkable. The knowledge these communities carried about the desert environment was, in the most literal sense, the accumulated product of tens of thousands of years of observation and refinement. The botanical knowledge alone, the understanding of which plants provided food, water, medicine, and material for tools in a landscape that appears to offer almost nothing, was of a depth and specificity that astonished every researcher who encountered it. The desert people knew where water could be found after rain by reading the behavior of specific insects. They knew which plant roots, pounded and soaked, produced water in drought conditions. They knew the locations of native wells, not springs, but constructed features, places where previous generations had deepened a natural depression or lined a seepage point with stones to increase water collection. Sites invisible to an untrained eye, but known and maintained across generations. All of this knowledge encoded in oral tradition, and in practice and in direct experience of the land. All of it maintained without writing, without maps, without any of the external storage systems that modern society uses to preserve information. The last known instance of an Aboriginal community from the Western Desert making first contact with the wider Australian society occurred in 1984. When a group of 9 people emerged from the Gibson Desert in Western Australia. They had been living entirely traditionally, maintaining the full cultural and knowledge system of their people until that year. There may be individuals or very small groups still living in remote desert country who have chosen to maintain separation from wider society. This is not confirmed and is not claimed. But the fact that it was possible as recently as 1984 is a reminder that the ancient is not only buried, in some cases it is still walking. The desert holds it still. Before we move on, we need to stay a moment longer at the Willandra Lakes, because what happened in 2003 was not the result of a deliberate search. It was not the product of a carefully planned excavation or a research program targeting that specific area of the lake bed. It was the result of rain. A ranger named Mary Pappen Jr. was walking across the surface of a clay pan near Lake Mungo after a period of unusually heavy rainfall when she noticed shapes in the exposed sediment, shapes that looked like they had been made by something pressing into soft mud. She called the rest of the community together. She called the researchers, and what they found over the following weeks of careful documentation was something that no one had been expecting to find there. 457 footprints from at least 23 different individuals, made in the mud of a lakeshore that had been wet and then dried, and then covered by accumulating sediment, and then covered again across 19,000 to 23,000 years of time, but until the right amount of rain at the right time removed the thin layer of surface sediment and exposed them. The footprints have since been reburied by wind-blown sediment. They are protected. They are there, beneath the surface, exactly as they were when they were first documented. The documentation effort was extensive. Hundreds of photographs, detailed survey measurements, casts of individual footprints. But the footprints themselves are back in the ground. The researchers who worked on the initial documentation described the experience of seeing them as disorienting. They are not the footprints of people long gone in the sense of belonging to a world that no longer exists. They are the footprints of people who were walking on a wet lakeshore on a day that felt, to them, ordinary. Some were walking slowly, some were running. A group of them, based on the track patterns, appear to have been walking together in the same direction at the same time. One set of tracks shows a person who appears to have had only one leg, moving at a pace that would have required the use of a crutch or a pole. This person was not moving slowly. The stride pattern indicates someone maintaining a reasonable pace across the muddy ground, which means they were mobile and capable and apparently functioning normally within their community. This is, in the most fundamental sense, a moment. A frozen, preserved moment of 23,000 years ago, not a tomb or a monument or a tool, a moment of people simply going about their day on the shore of a lake that no longer exists. The clay pan extends for several hundred meters in multiple directions. It has only been exposed by erosion in one area. What lies beneath the surface of the rest of it, in the sediment layers that have not been exposed, is unknown. There may be more footprints. There may be a larger group. There may be a trackway that tells a longer story. The rain will decide when the next exposure happens. The people of the lake will wait. When the first deep cave systems of Australia were explored seriously in the 20th century, researchers expected to find what cave explorers typically find: geological formations, some fossil material in caves that functioned as animal traps, and the occasional bat colony. What they found in some locations was something much stranger. In the groundwater systems beneath the Western Australian desert, specifically in the calcretes, which are calcium carbonate deposits that form in the shallow subsurface of arid landscapes. So researchers began to discover in the 1990s and early 2000s that there were animals living in complete darkness, in water that had been isolated from the surface environment for thousands to tens of thousands of years, in tiny pore spaces within the rock. These animals are called Stygofauna. The prefix comes from the river Styx, the mythological river of the underworld. They are animals that live their entire lives underground, in groundwater, without any contact with the surface world. They have no pigmentation because there is no light to see color. They have no functional eyes in most cases because there is nothing to see. They have evolved their bodies and their senses for a world of darkness and stillness and ancient water. What makes the Western Australian Stygofauna remarkable is their diversity and their age. In a region near the Pilbara, researchers have now identified more than 800 species of Stygofauna, many of them entirely new to science and found nowhere else on Earth. These include crustaceans, worms, beetles, and other invertebrates that have been evolving in isolation in the subsurface water of the Western Australian desert for millions of years. The isolation is real. Each calcrete aquifer system is essentially a separate island, disconnected from neighbouring systems by zones of dry rock. Each island has its own population of Stygofauna, descended from surface ancestors that colonised the groundwater millions of years ago, and have been evolving in isolation ever since. The genetic divergence between populations in neighbouring calcrete systems confirms that the isolation is ancient and complete. Some of these animals have characteristics that suggest they have been underground, isolated and evolving for at least 30 million years. Their ancestors walked on the surface of an Australia that was still wet, still forested, still connected to Antarctica by the land bridge that had not yet fully separated. The Australia they colonized no longer exists. The Australia above them now is not the Australia of their ancestors. But in the darkness of the calcretes, in the thin films of ancient water moving through pores in the rock, their descendants are still there. They are not fossils. They are not preserved specimens. They are alive, living animals going about the business of living in an environment that has been sealed from the surface world for longer than modern humans have existed. The diversity of the Western Australian Stygofauna is still being described. New species are still being found. The calcrete systems of the Pilbara and Murchison regions cover vast areas, and only a fraction of the groundwater bores drilled in the region have been sampled for biological material. The full extent of what lives underground is not known. 30 million years of evolution happening in the dark, beneath the red sand of the Australian desert, while above them, on the surface, everything that has ever lived in Australia has come and gone. There is a kind of science practiced quietly by soil scientists and geomorphologists and environmental historians that is not as dramatic as paleontology and not as accessible as rock art, but it produces information about the ancient world that no other discipline can provide. The science of reading ancient soils. Across the Australian interior, there are layers of soil and sediment that preserve chemical and physical evidence of climate conditions going back hundreds of thousands of years. The deep red soils of the Australian desert are not simply dry and infertile because the desert is dry and infertile now. They are red because of the presence of iron oxides that form under specific weathering conditions. The chemistry of those iron compounds tells you something about the temperature and moisture conditions under which the soil formed. In many parts of the interior, the soil profile contains layers that represent fundamentally different climate periods. A layer of fine red windblown silt from the glacial maximum when dust storms swept across the continent. Beneath that, a layer of coarser, heavier sediment deposited by water from a wetter period when rivers ran across what is now desert. Beneath that, another layer of windblown material. Beneath that, features suggesting the presence of vegetation dense enough to hold the soil together against wind erosion, which requires rainfall well above current desert levels. These layers are an archive, a physical record of how the climate of the Australian interior has changed over hundreds of thousands of years. The sequence of wet and dry periods, the timing of glacial maxima and interglacial warm periods, the response of the landscape to global climate shifts, all of it preserved in the chemistry and texture of the soil. The most ancient soils in Australia are extraordinary. The Yilgarn Craton of Western Australia supports what are called lateritic soils. It deeply weathered profiles that formed under warm, humid conditions during the Eocene epoch, approximately 50 million years ago, when Australia was still in a wetter climatic regime. These soils are so deeply weathered that the original mineral content of the rock has been entirely converted to iron and aluminum oxides. The red and yellow duri crusts that cap many Western Australian hills and plateaus are the remnants of this ancient weathering, preserved at the surface because the landscape is so flat and stable that erosion has not removed them. 50 million years of weathering, preserved in the colour of the ground. And within the lateritic profiles, in the layers between the duricrust and the fresh rock below, there are minerals that contain information about the groundwater chemistry, the rainfall patterns, and the temperature regimes of the Eocene and subsequent epochs. Information that cannot be obtained any other way because the organisms that lived in that environment left no fossils, and the plants that grew in that landscape left no preserved pollen. The only record is in the rock and the soil. The ancient soils of Australia are telling a story about a continent that was once wet and forested and warm, that dried and cooled over millions of years as it moved northward away from Antarctica and as the global climate shifted, that has been transformed from a green continent to a red one over a time frame that dwarfs everything human civilization has ever accomplished. The redness of the Australian outback is not incidental. It is history. The colour of time written in iron. One more buried thing. This one buried not in rock, but in time. The Aboriginal Australians have the oldest known astronomical tradition on Earth. Not the oldest written astronomical tradition. The oldest astronomical tradition, full stop. European astronomy has a written record going back roughly 4,000 years in Babylonia. The astronomical traditions of ancient Egypt, India, and China extend to similar timescales, between 3,000 and 5,000 years of documented observation and theory. These are the traditions we typically refer to when we discuss the history of astronomy. But the astronomical knowledge encoded in the oral traditions, ceremony, and landscape alignments of the Aboriginal Australian peoples is of a fundamentally different antiquity. Research by Dwayne Hamaker of the University of Melbourne and colleagues has documented astronomical knowledge across multiple Aboriginal traditions that appears to be ancient in ways that are difficult to fully date, but that far exceed any written astronomical record. Some of this knowledge is embedded in the features of the landscape itself. Rock alignments at sites in Victoria, New South Wales, and elsewhere appear to mark the rising or setting of specific stars or specific solar events in ways that require deliberate construction and precise astronomical observation. The most significant stone alignment site in Australia is at Warratyi near Werribee in Victoria, where a horseshoe-shaped arrangement of basalt stones, approximately 50 metres in diameter, has been shown to align with the summer and winter solstice sunsets and with the equinox sunsets with a precision that strongly suggests intentional astronomical marking. The site is on Wathaurong country, and the traditional owners have maintained knowledge of its significance across an unknown number of generations. The age of Warratyi is not precisely established. It could be hundreds of years old. It could be thousands. The alignment precision is consistent with deliberate astronomical construction, but the site has not been dated using methods that would give an accurate age for when the stones were placed. What is more readily dated is the astronomical information encoded in the oral traditions themselves. As with the geographical traditions that appear to preserve information about pre-glacial coastlines, some astronomical traditions appear to encode observations of astronomical events that can be assigned to specific time periods. The Kamilaroi and Uluru peoples of New South Wales have astronomical traditions that describe specific configurations of the Pleiades star cluster in relation to the horizon at significant times of year, configurations that do not match the current position of the Pleiades due to the precession of the equinoxes, but that match the position the Pleiades would have occupied approximately 7,000 years ago. If this analysis is correct, elements of the oral astronomical tradition of the Kamilaroi and Uluru peoples preserve accurate observational data from at least 7,000 years ago. Observational data from a time before writing existed anywhere on Earth. The Aboriginal tradition of dark constellation astronomy, in which the shapes of significance in the night sky are found not in the patterns of bright stars, but in the dark dust lanes of the Milky Way, is unique in world astronomy. Other astronomical traditions are built around bright star patterns. The Aboriginal tradition includes a parallel system in which the dark spaces between the stars form the shapes of animals, the emu in the sky being the most famous, which stretch across the southern Milky Way in a form recognizable to anyone who looks for it once they know what to look for. This dark constellation tradition appears to encode precise seasonal information. The orientation of the emu in the sky changes across the year as the Milky Way rotates overhead. At specific times of year, the orientation of the celestial emu corresponds to behaviors in the real animals. The time when emus lay eggs, when emus are active at dusk, when emus are near water. The correspondence is precise enough to function as an ecological calendar, telling a knowledgeable observer not just what month it is, but what food resources are available and what activities the landscape is ready to support. This is not decorative. This is not mythology in the sense of mere storytelling. This is a functional knowledge system encoded in the most durable medium available, the sky itself. 65,000 years of people looking up at the same stars from the same continent and writing what they saw in the only record that would last. We have come a long way. From the 3.5 billion year old microfossils of the Pilbara, where life left its first confirmed trace in the rock of the Archean Earth, to the Ediacaran seas of the Flinders Ranges, where the first complex bodies formed in shallow water 600 million years ago, to the fire from space that struck the Great Sandy Desert 300,000 years ago and left a crater that still holds the climate record of 3 glacial cycles sealed inside it. We have travelled through the aquaculture of the Gunditjmara, older than Stonehenge, the songlines that encode geographical knowledge, older than agriculture, the oldest art tradition on Earth still being added to by living custodians in the Kimberley, the genome of a population isolated for 50,000 years, carrying within it the genetic echoes of encounters with species of human that no longer exist, the zircon crystals of the Yilgarn that hold within their atomic structure the evidence of liquid water on Earth 4.4 billion years ago, and through all of it, the knowledge that what has been found is a fraction of what is there. The Australian continental shelf, underwater since the end of the last ice age, contains an archaeological record of the first Australians that has barely been examined. In the 120 metres of water that now covers the ancient coastline where people lived for tens of thousands of years, there are campsites, hearths, stone tools and middens lying under marine sediment, preserved by the same cold water and lack of disturbance that preserves any sealed deposit. The technology to access and excavate this material at depth exists, but the resources required to do it systematically have not been committed. The Nullarbor cave systems have passages that have not been explored. The bones in their sealed chambers have not been catalogued. The fossil record they contain may extend further back in time and represent more species than current evidence suggests. The rock art of the Kimberley is still being found. New sites, identified by working with traditional owners who know where their country's significant places are still being formally recorded. Some of these sites have not been seen by a researcher in decades. Some have never been formally documented. The full extent of the Kimberley tradition is not known. The sediment beneath the dry lake beds of inland Australia, the former water bodies of the Willandra Lake system, and the dozens of other ancient lakes that dried as the climate changed at the end of the last glacial maximum, contains human artifacts and bones lying undisturbed in the same positions they were deposited in. The footprints of Lake Mungo, exposed after heavy rain and then reburied by wind, are waiting for the next erosion event. There may be more footprint surfaces beneath the surface layer. There may be burials, campsites, and material culture that no researcher has yet encountered. And there is the thing that is perhaps most remarkable of all. The Aboriginal Australians themselves have been here for this entire story, not as passive observers, but as active participants, maintaining knowledge of their country, managing its ecosystems, recording its features in art and song and ceremony across a span of time that defies easy comprehension. The knowledge held in living oral traditions, maintained and transmitted across 65,000 years without interruption, but represents a form of evidence about the ancient past that archaeology and geology are only beginning to learn how to use. The stories that encode geographical information about coastlines that existed before the sea rose. The ceremonial traditions that record the presence of animals that have been extinct for 40,000 years. The ecological knowledge of how the land works, what it produces, how it behaves across decades and centuries and millennia of climate variation. This knowledge is also buried, not in rock, not in sediment, but in memory and in practice, which are more fragile than stone, but no less real. The Outback looks empty from the window of a plane. It looks ancient in the way that all deserts look ancient, bare and windswept and indifferent. But it is ancient in a way that almost nothing else on Earth is ancient. Ancient in its geological bones, in its fossil record, in its living traditions, in its accumulated knowledge. We have barely started to understand what is down there. The answer to the question the title asks is this: everything. Everything is buried beneath the Australian outback. Everything except the parts that are still above the surface, waiting to be seen. There is one more thing to say before we close. If you have been listening to all of this while the darkness settled around you, while the sounds of the day gave way to the sounds of the night, it is worth carrying one image with you into sleep. In the Jack Hills of Western Australia, there is a creek bed, unremarkable from any distance. Reddish rock, sparse vegetation, the sound of the wind. And in the rock of that creek bed, though smaller than a grain of sand but readable by a mass spectrometer, there are zircon crystals that formed 4.404 billion years ago, when the Earth was new, when no life existed anywhere, when the planet was still cooling from its formation. Those crystals have been there through every ice age, every extinction, every tectonic upheaval, every sea level rise and fall, every million years of wind and sun and time that the Australian continent has experienced. And now the zircon holds, in its atomic structure, evidence that the Earth already had liquid water when it was less than 200 million years old, the oldest solid thing we know of, telling us that the conditions for life arrived early, and that this red and quiet continent has been holding its secrets longer than we have words for. The desert is patient. It has been waiting for the right questions for a very long time. Sleep well, and when you wake, look at the ground beneath your feet a little differently. It has seen more than you can imagine. If this is the kind of content that calls to you, the kind of telling that starts in deep time and slowly, carefully, works its way toward the present, then this is where you belong. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight, whether it is a city apartment with the window cracked, a regional town where the stars are starting to come out, or somewhere quiet where you chose this particular kind of company at the end of the day. I read every comment and I genuinely want to know. The next time we gather here, we will go somewhere else that looks ordinary from the surface and reveals something extraordinary underneath. Because that is what this is, a place where the surface is never the whole story. Take care of yourself tonight, and thank you genuinely for spending this time here.